My name is David Kang. I'm a professor in International Relations and Business, and I'm the interim director of the East Asian Studies Center this year. And so I'm delighted to be here at the conference. I will be moderating today's session, so you won't see too much of me, other than I will be introducing the speakers, and then I'll be handling the questions and answers. So I will be bad cop if I say, please get to the point. And the other thing that I'd like you to remember to do is please turn off your cell phones and put them on vibrate so that they don't interrupt our speakers. So if you could do that, that would be wonderful. We have a really amazing lineup today. And what I'm going to do is introduce each of the speakers as they come up. So I won't introduce them all at once. And actually, their long bios are actually in the program. So what I'm going to do is just briefly introduce them. And our first speaker is Hai Ren, a professor of East Asian languages at the University of Arizona. And he will be leading us off today with a presentation about leisure as an event of self-formation at a Chinese theme park. So please join me in welcoming Professor.
Okay. Just want to make sure things working. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for Andrea and the organizers who invite me to this conference. And I think no better than this place and UCLA as the place to talk about theme parks, media, and culture. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my research. And this presentation is part of a larger book project. Actually, it's a part of a series of projects. So what I'm presenting here is actually just a small part. And there are many dimensions of the argument. And I hope Professor Yan will pointing out those issues. I think there are lots of issues are debatable, right? So that's the first point. What I want to begin by just show you a few slides. And the first slide is actually a shopping street from Chengdu. Many of you know this. This is, well-known design image of South China Mall in Dongguan. And lots of themed malls, and this is a Panda Mall in Chengdu. If you actually read Chinese, you will know those are actually themed sections of the mall, right? And themed residential communities. Everybody talked about the OCT this morning, but actually there are so many other companies involved in real estate project. This one is from China Resources, another Hong Kong-based Chinese state-owned companies. And some of you also know this is part of the themed towns, in around Shanghai. And the images are from just an ordinary visitor's website, so you can see her documentation of her own life through this blog or website. And she went to all the national pavilions and changed her costumes and take photos, being part of the experience of the Shanghai World Expo. Of course, I speak as a cultural anthropologist, so I pay attention to culture issues, pay attention to everyday life. And I guess theme parks is one of the topics you can talk about it from many different angles. So I want you to keep that in mind. And those are the different sources. I won't go into details to talk about any one of them. I just want to give you the information so that you know there are different sources of the whole phenomena. So I'm just going to mostly read because sometimes to talk about the nuances is very difficult without reading text. So the development of themed built environments, such as those we just seen, whether in China or elsewhere, follows a global trend towards integrating the combined practices of consumption, entertainment, education, merchandising, performative work, and control and surveillance. So there are lots of scholars doing research on a range of phenomena in relation to themed built environments. These spaces are often designed intentionally to produce certain kinds of consumer subjects who are tied less to being shoppers, but more to particular social norms. Theme-built environments in China, I argue, played a very important part in the production of Chinese consumers as middle-class subjects, the kind of consumers who built their lives through the do-it-yourself, DIY mode of life-building process. I want to talk about the scholarship on this one. The historical context in which this takes place is the transformation of Chinese society into a risk society, in which individuals and non-governmental organizations take over responsibilities once assigned to the government. This shift is a result of China's neoliberalization, the transformation of China from a socialist country to a neoliberal state, which refers to both the Chinese nation state under a hybrid capitalist/socialist system and China as a country where economic rationalism penetrates all aspects of society, including domains such as the cultural, the political, that are usually incommensurable or incompatible with the economic realm. Of course, those things changes historically. In Chinese risk society, the embrace of neoliberal economic and political system has forced the development of new governmental and social policies to stabilize China's growing inequality through the conceptual category of the middle class, 中产阶层. Against this background, the individual's life building takes the form of self-formation, but only in such a way that it becomes measured by the new social norm of the middle class. That is, the middle class norm is primarily used to regulate and discipline behaviors of Chinese citizens to make them become more responsible, not only for the ongoing stability of Chinese society, but also for their own success or failure. In this presentation, I use ethnographic information I have collected since the mid-1990s to analyze how individuals who aspire to become middle class develop their responsibility-bearing capacity by looking at how a themed built environment like a theme park shapes consumer conduct and how consumers carefully calculate their responses to this regulation. I will use the Chinese Ethnic Culture Park in Beijing as a case study, which is one of the parks mentioned earlier this morning. Established in the early 1990s, the park is located to the west of the National Olympic Center in Beijing. It occupies a total of 45 hectares divided into two sites. The north side, about half of the site, the total site, was first opened in public in 1994. Development of the south side was completed in 2003. The cost of the construction for the first phase of the development was about 36.1 million, and depends on the exchange rate. You know, we have different figures. 85% came from Taiwan and Hong Kong. You learned about this morning. At the north side, the park is organized into 16 life-size replicas of ethnic villages. each representing the vernacular housing and dwelling environment of one of the China's national ethnic groups, 民族, that's the Chinese term. Each village displays artifacts used in daily life, furnishings, domestic architecture, cultural performances, and items for sale, such as food, tea, souvenirs. Park employees who participate in the cultural performances were hired from their home villages or towns. The exhibit of 民族文化, they call them ethnic cultures, in the park participate in a form of temporality pervasive in Chinese representations of the non-Han others that relegates them to a space of tradition outside urban modernity. However, the temporality of the park is marked by a series of monthly festivals, 节日, These are composed of both official national holidays and festivals of different ethnic groups. Ethnic performances are scheduled in close coordination with the movement of visitors through different exhibits, shops, and restaurants. This arrangement reveals the park as a highly structured environment in which overdetermines how it will be consumed. Visitors are positioned as consumers who are directed towards the appropriate modes of economic behavior already set up for them. I have lots of those examples, so to save time, I won't talk about any one of those. To understand visiting the park as an event of self-formation, we need to develop a good understanding of how the tourist's participatory experience becomes intertwined with negotiating the carefully structured time provided by the park by paying attention to such aspects of an event such as presence, direction, status, duration, speed, and techniques. Any of those aspects we can unpack and talk about the details, the nuances. A tourist may negotiate the park's time through consuming activities, such as buying things sold inside the park, spending time and energy inside the park. A tourist may also engage in productive activities, especially through media spectacles, such as taking photos, making videos, and blogging. One of the larger major aspects of my research is to observe how people have changed their behaviors by using cameras, video cameras, all those things, over 10-year period. I did actually surprisingly see some of the differences. It's very interesting to notice those aspects. So this kind of practices ultimately leads to the production of values and their associated behaviors that are tied to cosmopolitanism and civility and conduct of citizenship. Visiting a theme park as an activity consumes time. It takes the form of time management. So show you a few examples of time management. For many, a calculation of the monetary value of their time is necessary. This was the case for a family from Jiangxi. The group included a school teacher in her early 30s, her mother-in-law, her daughter, her sister's daughter, and 2 boys of other relatives. The total cost of admission for this group was 240. It depends on the admission prices changes. But although the school teacher felt the cost of the tickets to be higher than she had anticipated, she decided to spend the money anyway since they had taken all the trouble to get there. Once inside, they did as many activities as possible, visiting all the villages, participating in the festival, and taking photos. The school teacher mentioned how pleased they were to see ethnic minority artifacts since they live far away from any ethnic minority region. At the Miao village, she spent 20 yuan to rent Miao costumes for all 4 children. The children laughed in excitement to see each other wearing the colorful and decorated clothing as the younger women taking photographs of them. In the end, the whole group want to be photographed. In this case, the admission was high enough to warrant a careful calculation of costs and benefits. I wonder whether the school teacher was willing to invest it in the experience, not so much for herself as for the investment in her children's middle-class mobility. Learning about the ethnic minority cultures on display justified the value of their visit. The cultural value of ethnic minority culture on display is a form of leisured pastime that enriches middle-class identity as a form of educational entertainment. The photographs that captured cross-dressed bodies, ethnic Chinese in male costumes, commemorate a very uneasy decision of having to spend money and time in this way. Long after their visit, the photographs would enable them to waste a value from their purchase again and again, sharing their experience with the absent husband and father of their family group, will further extend the experience of their visit as a process of self-formation, making themselves both known and knowable in this context as middle-class consumers. In participatory consumption, a visitor often negotiates with the park's instrumental time of consumption through an enactment of personal time as a way to create a temporal consciousness of an exceptional visit or memorable visit, right? In such a situation, contingency becomes unleashed as a power enabling a visitor to suspend the regular rule of the park's instrumental time. The issue is fundamentally about who has the power to control what is eventful in visiting experience. Some might succeed and others fail. Let me look at a couple of examples. The first is an interruptive practice pointing to positive directions. A group of 20 visitors from northeastern China arrived one morning at the Dazhao Temple in the Zhang village. Zhang is the Chinese term for Tibetan. One man went up to the second floor and stopped in front of the statue of a Buddha while holding a water bottle. He bowed to the statue. Afterwards, he deposited a few coins into the donation box and said, quote, "This small amount of money conveys my respect to you." The man's act of worship suggests that worship in the park is different from what might occur outside. In the normal temple, a worshiper would be either empty-handed or holding a stick while bowing to a god. Holding a water bottle and donating such a small amount of money marked his act of worship as an interruption of a normal or conventional behavior. The eventfulness of this interruption is multidimensional. The bowing is a demonstration or a performance of belief rather than faith. Moreover, the tiny amount of donation is insignificant, but it is a gesture towards giving, an affective expression of charity, an impulsive act rather than a rational philanthropic effort. Nevertheless, it is considered as a norm of becoming a responsible middle-class citizen in China. The second example addresses the negative aspect of an interactive practice. After visiting the temple, two men in the group decided to go back to the main gate to hire a tour guide. While waiting, the rest walked into a gift shop selling jewelry, T-shirts, toys, books, films, and many, many other things. The solitary sales clerk was overwhelmed and thus failed to notice that a woman from the group took a bright-colored paper umbrella without paying, and so that's the one. Later that day, as the group followed the tour guide past the shop, the sales clerk suddenly recognized the umbrella held by the woman and asked her to pay for it or return it. The woman denied in taking umbrella at first, but due to the sales clerk's insistence, she eventually returned the umbrella to the shop. In this example, interruption becomes delinquency, a form of negative agency. With the redistribution of social responsibility in China's neoliberalization, a middle-class citizen is an entrepreneur, someone who becomes successful in both calculating the rules rather than abiding them, and become responsible for one's own behavior. Because the middle-class citizen is responsible for minimizing social risks, the person is held liable for increasing or elevating risk. The woman clearly miscalculates her ability to flaunt the rules without damaging her claims to middle-class respectability. The sales clerk did not call the park security guard, but instead chased the woman and forced her to return the umbrella. This sequence of actions created a spectacle of discipline. That is, a spectacle that communicates clues to what is permissible and what is prohibited, addressed not just the shoplifting woman herself, but also to the whole group by circulating the norm of calculated self-responsibility as a civic value. Such activities as photo taking, interacting with an exhibit, or buying a souvenir are common enough. Indeed, the park is set up to invite and authorize visitors to do all of these things. However, this arrangement does not specify how and when these activities take place, nor does it determine which visitor will engage in them. Each visitor normally has a certain degree of autonomy in decision-making. While a visitor interrupts normal activity, whether it's duration, status, direction, speed, or techniques. However, the visitor begins to reveal whether she or he can be a sovereign consumer. That is the person who decides whether he or she might be exceptional to norms and rules. Let me just give you a short conclusion. In responsive and responsible consumer practices, the middle-class norm becomes disseminated to the individualized process of life-making and life-building. In this context, it is practically impossible to speak of a set of consistent characteristics that positively constitute the ideal middle-class subject. The operations of a theme-built environment like a theme park played an important role in guiding the users/consumers/visitors to read some of the clues of being a middle-class subject by making intelligible some of the boundaries between the responsible and the irresponsible, between the permissible and the prohibited. This has become a general trend in media development in China. In recent years, media have frequently published stories about successful Chinese mainland citizens traveling to overseas, whether or not as students, shoppers, business people, or tourists. Some compare the spending habits of Chinese shoppers with Americans, Japanese, Germans in the post-World War II period, while others discuss the impact of their behaviors in their host countries. One major issue repeatedly raised is about the uncivil behavior of Chinese tourists. In September 2005, for instance, pictures of and reports of mainland Chinese tourists spitting, sprawling on the ground, allowing their children to urinate in public, and smoking in prohibited areas at Hong Kong's newly opened Disneyland triggered scattering criticism in the Hong Kong mainland and overseas media. Chinese commentaries on this news story argue that their fellow citizens need to improve their human quality, 素质, by changing their old habits and learning to conduct themselves in a more civil manner. Chinese tourist industry and the Chinese government responded by launching a series of campaigns to promote courteous behavior. The Chinese National Tourist Administration released 2 detailed lists of behaviors recommended for the civilized Chinese traveler, one addressing domestic travel and the other for overseas. With the proliferation of new media such as the internet and mobile media, Chinese netizens in recent years have developed a popular practice called human flash search, 人肉搜索. I won't talk about the context but the deployment of the spectacle as a means to communicate the norm of calculated self-responsibility becomes common. Online users often intentionally embarrass offenders by, whether individually or collectively. So in 2007, Green Woodpecker Project that curbs public speeding, its leader Wang Tao posted action shots on his website to humiliate offenders. During the Shanghai World Expo in 2010, numerous discussions were generated about the behavior of Chinese visitors, beginning in late April, when the public was first allowed to visit the park, the expo. Pictures and reports of bad behavior appeared online. Each report, earlier reports focused on how panicked the crowd behaved. Later, reports and photos often addressed delinquent visitors, such as those pretending to be disabled by using a wheelchair to bypass other visitors waiting in a long line. These visitors whose bad behavior is captured and circulated in public where the internet will be held responsible for as long as their records are kept online. These cases show the new media practices extend the policing of social order from the architectural space to the cyberspace. As governmental policies promoting the individual's do-it-yourself biographical process are widely implemented, calculating rather than abiding rules and laws, that is, making sense of the boundaries between the legal and the illegal, between the permissible and the prohibited, and between the legitimate and the illegitimate, becomes an integral part of consumer entrepreneurism. Consequently, as in the case of innumerable visits to ethnic theme park, couple sentences, yeah. A consumer's life building through self-fashioning may become positive if the consumer successfully exercises calculation, but it also becomes a negative process, whether deferred, regressed, or sidetracked. When the consumer's exercise of calculation is recognized as a delinquency, as in the case of the tourist stealing an umbrella at the park. In this situation, instead of a project of anticipating the coming of the future, this form of life building accumulates risks and liabilities to social prosperity of one sort or another. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me set it for them.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello. There we go. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Our next speaker will be Sun Shaojing from the School of Journalism at Fudan University, who will be doing a presentation of a co-authored piece with Jay Wang from USC on experiencing cultures. Chinese visitors' encounter with nation brands at the Shanghai Expo. So please welcome Professor Sun. Oh, are you going next? My apologies. I had the wrong lineup. Sorry. Our next speaker will be Susan Brownell, professor of anthropology from the University of Missouri St. Louis, who will be doing a talk on the World Expo Shanghai 2010, why it wasn't a media event, but still drew 70 million spectators. So please welcome Professor Brownell.
Thank you. From the mid-19th century to the first third of the 20th century, world exposition sat at the pinnacle of a huge panoply of cultural genres that sold exotic experiences of cultural difference to an emerging mass audience. After the success of the 1893 Midway Plaisance, the amusement zone at the World's Fair in Chicago, theme parks emerged out of this, what you might call polymorphous performativity, a phrase which describes the fact that the distinctions between education and entertainment were not as institutionalized as they are now. The lines between museums, zoos, circuses, historical reenactments, sports, Wild West shows, World's Fairs, and so on were not as clear as they are now. The modern Olympic Games, which were revived in 1896, also emerged out of this polymorphous performativity. The third modern Olympic Games, and the first ones to be held in North America, were held in St. Louis in conjunction with the 1904 World's Fair. And since St. Louis is where I live and work, I'll make a little bit of comparison with these events below. The second through the fourth installments of the modern Olympic Games, which was 1900, 1904, and 1908, were held in conjunction with international expositions. After that time, the divisions between cultural genres became institutionalized, and this process included a separation between Olympic Games and World's Fairs, and theme parks too. So until the fourth Olympics in 1912, and that was when the political tensions leading to World War I stimulated the interest in national governments in the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games were essentially minor sideshows to the spectacle of World's Fairs. And World's Fairs were essentially the driving economic powers driving the development of a number of genres, which also included theme parks. For example, in St. Louis in 1904, there were a total of about 3,000 exotic indigenous peoples from all around the world who were on display inside and outside the fairgrounds. And then when the fair is over, they need a place to go. So they sort of drove the, trade in exotic peoples, and American Indians were in on this. They would go separate and go to different venues throughout the country, and theme parks were one of them. Anyway, 1 century later, so Olympic Games after 1912 began an upward trajectory, and in many ways, World's Fairs were sort of on the downswing, at least in terms of being the world's premier cultural event. And then 1 century later, the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games were by many measures the biggest media event in human history. And that was with television viewership of get to that in a moment. A television viewership of approximately 70% of the world's population. And then 2 years later, the Shanghai Expo did not attract nearly as much domestic or international media coverage as the Beijing Olympics, but it did attract a record 73 million spectators. And so I'm going to discuss this difference in a moment. So just to sort of review a little bit of history here in the West, Olympic Games and World Expos started with a shared history, but they were ultimately driven apart. But in East Asia, they've retained some connection due to the association with nationalism. Japan was the first East Asian nation to host an Olympic Games or a World's Fair. Its coming out party on the world stage was originally scheduled for 1940, when it was to host both the Grand International Exposition of Japan and the Olympic Games in Tokyo, but neither was held due to the escalating war. As a result, Japan's debut on the world stage was postponed until the Tokyo Olympic Games in 1964, followed by the Osaka Expo in 1970. The Osaka Expo set the attendance record of 64 million people, which became the target that the Shanghai Coordinating Bureau was determined to surpass. And this model of hosting an Olympic Games and an Expo in close sequence became an East Asian model that was emulated by South Korea and then China. So South Korea was next, hosting the Seoul Olympic Games in 1988, followed by the Daejeon Specialized Expo in 1993. Specialized expos are one grade lower than a World Expo in the official ranking system that's now in place. Interestingly, the Daejeon Expo celebrated the 100-year anniversary of Korea's first ever participation in a world exposition, which was the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And both expositions and Olympic Games are a sort of a measure of status in the world, in the sense that only 4 world expositions have been held outside the West, and only 3 summer Olympic Games have been held outside the West. Beijing was the 3rd. And I did not feel that this model of first hosting an Olympic Games and then an Expo was very prevalent in the Western audience today, although it was a model that was used by Canada. Montreal had used it with the 1967 Expo, followed by the 1976 Olympic Games. And you know, some observers do feel that helped establish Canada as a player on the world stage, but that seems to be largely forgotten. So understanding the forces that drove World's Fairs and Olympic Games apart in the West and kept them together in East Asia is also interesting for providing a greater understanding of the ways in which great cultural performances play different roles in these world regions at the same time that they're embedded in a global environment. So the Beijing Olympics were what Daniel Dayan and Elihu Katz have labeled a media event, which is a historic occasion that transfixes a nation or the world through the festive viewing of television. And I think obviously they were a media event of global scale. By contrast, the Shanghai Expo was well covered in the Chinese state media, but that was in large part because they were directed to cover it. But it received surprisingly little coverage in the global media, especially given its scale and its importance to China. So just running through some figures here. Both the Olympics and Expo did set new records for national participation in the event. 204 nations and territories participated in the Beijing Olympics. That includes all 192 states of the United Nations and 13 territories not recognized as sovereign states, and Hong Kong and quote-unquote Chinese Taipei come under that category. Actually, there was one state missing, and that was Brunei, which neglected to send any athletes and was not allowed to participate in the opening ceremonies at the last moment. So in the Olympics, the participation of developing nations is increasingly made possible by financial distributions from the International Olympic Committee, which the abbreviation is the IOC, so I'll be using that phrase, an international NGO incorporated in Switzerland. So in particular, the IOC uses the television broadcast fees and gives distributions to national Olympic committees. The political importance of the Beijing Olympics is seen in the fact that over 100 national dignitaries, of which about 85 were sovereign, were heads of state, took part in the Olympic opening ceremony. And this was more than had ever attended any previous ceremony, and it was the first opening ceremony outside the US attended by an American president. On the other hand, in the Shanghai Expo, Again, a large number of countries, 189, and also 57 international organizations. Many of those countries, their participation was made possible by subsidies from the Chinese government. These were, developing and third world countries. Only 20 heads of states attended the opening ceremony, and most of them were from the developing countries and African nations whose attendance was paid for by China. So the only heads of state representing Western powers were the President of France, the Prime Minister of Holland, and the President of the European Commission. And the presidents of South and North Korea were also present. The Beijing Olympic Games, as I said, were the most watched Olympic Games ever, and probably the most watched event in human history. Approximately 70% of the world's population, or 4.7 billion viewers, accessed television coverage at some time during the Games. Some 94% of the Chinese population tuned in at some point. In the US, the Games ranked as the most watched television event ever. 32,000 journalists attended the actual event. And anyway, pretty amazing figures. On the other hand, the television signal for the Shanghai Expo opening ceremony was offered free of charge. I don't have figures on how many nations broadcast the ceremony live in its entirety. US networks did not, although it was reported that 2 French television channels did. I did not find an official number for registered journalists, but an estimate of 10,000 journalists was given, of which 2,000 worked for overseas media. If you put the search terms Beijing and Olympic into the Nexus Lexis database, looking at major English language world media, and I did this for the time period from 1 month before the opening ceremony until the closing ceremony, so about 1 month and 2 weeks. And I called up 33,665 items, so this many reports in major world media in the English language in 1.5 months about the Olympic Games. On the other hand, the words Shanghai and World Expo, and this was actually for a longer period, for the entire 6 months of the duration of the Expo, only called up 1,999 items. So this is only 9% of the number of the Olympic reports, and that's for a period of 6 months as opposed to 1.5 months. So in sum, the Shanghai Expo did not attract nearly the global media attention nor the political attention of the Beijing Olympics. So why not? Oops. Some Western observers speculated that the Expo is simply an outmoded idea whose time has come and gone, and that it no longer holds an attraction for a Western audience. And there may be something to this, but I think it's also true that today's expos are managed by an intergovernmental organization created by a treaty, while the Olympic Games are managed by a marketing-savvy, non-governmental organization. So the organization that runs the expos is the BIE, the Bureau for International Expositions, and it's somewhat paralyzed by national politics. So, for example, the United States withdrew in 2001 and is no longer a member. Its marketing is practically non-existent. It does not sell the rights to its logo. While, on the other hand, the right to use the Olympic rings is possibly the most valuable corporate sponsorship on the planet. Since there's clearly still a great deal of popular demand worldwide for theme parks, I think we've seen that in previous discussions today, which interestingly were spawned by the international expos, and clearly there is worldwide demand for traveling shows such as circuses, acrobats. We think of the success of Cirque du Soleil. All of these are closely linked genres. I think it's not accurate to say that the idea of international expositions has completely lost its attraction, but I think perhaps the bigger problem is that an intergovernmental organization was not capable of maintaining the premier position of expositions in an increasingly competitive global cultural market. However, the institutional structure of the organization was only one factor in the Expo's failure to attract massive Western media attention. Both Chinese and Western journalists told me that there is no story in the Expo. Sports events create winners and losers, and that's considered to be an attractive story. The Expo provided countless opportunities for stories about intercultural interactions, but in today's media, that's not considered to be an attractive story. There was a major story, probably the major story of the Expo was the reshaping of Shanghai as an ultra-modern metropolis. Actually, this occurred in Beijing too, perhaps on a greater scale than in Shanghai, but it was overshadowed by the intense media interest in political issues. The Beijing Olympics became a platform for political conflicts, while the Expo, for the most part, did not. Why not? In its risk assessment at the one-year countdown to the opening ceremony, the IOC had identified 28 NGOs that had announced plans to use the Beijing Olympics to highlight political issues. Some of the most active were Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, and Students for a Free Tibet. The controversy over religious freedom in Tibet and human rights in China became a driving force in the Olympic media coverage. So, for example, a search of the terms Beijing and Olympic and human rights in the same time period as the previous search finds a total of 1,938 items in English. On the one hand, this is only 6% of the total numbers of articles on the Beijing Olympics, but on the other hand, this number is pretty much equal to the number of the entire total of reports on the Shanghai Expo in 6 months. So in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics, a mutual feedback circle had formed in which the advocacy NGOs created news by issuing reports on various aspects of China's human rights record, mass evictions, and so on. They issued reports, op-eds, press releases. They carried out highly visible protests. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were some of the most active in trying to manipulate public opinion. Western celebrities and star athletes created news by trying to organize protests and boycotts. And the international media themselves were not really a neutral platform for this debate. They were an interested party because of the fact that media freedom in China was one of the major issues. And so reporters in China could essentially report on themselves by covering efforts to restrict their reporting. I interviewed representatives of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Reporters Without Borders after both events were over. And I learned that each organization had discussed organizing a campaign around the Shanghai Expo, but they had all decided against it. The reason was that it was too close to the Beijing Olympics. Campaigns such as the big ones surrounding the Beijing Olympics are very expensive, and they demand a great deal of personnel time and financial expenditure, which takes away from the ability of these organizations to deal with issues in other parts of the world. In addition, there's the problem of audience fatigue. So, for example, Edward Nazarski, the president of Amnesty International in the Netherlands, told me, we didn't try to make it a big issue because we had done our part on China and we didn't feel we should do that again so soon. But that's more a campaigning decision than based on content. But you can't campaign forever just on basically the same things. You have to have some new perspectives, some new things, and we didn't have them. We decided at one point that we wouldn't try to make this big. It was too short to be again engaged in such lively and huge discussions. People would react by saying, yes, we know. Yes, everybody knows it's an issue, but what's your solution? And what's the new angle for that, or new perspective? So as a result, Shanghai and World Expo and Human Rights put into the database, the LexisNexis database, finds only 72 items in English, which is 4% of the total on the Expo. So in short, the escalating spiral of news mutually generated by NGOs and the Western media simply did not kick in for the Shanghai Expo. But it might not have been a media event. It did still attract more spectators than any other expo, and possibly more than any other bounded cultural event in human history. So why? First of all, I think we have to acknowledge that a substantial component of the spectators were essentially subsidized by the government. The Shanghai municipal government issued a gift packet containing one entrance ticket to every household of 2 or more people in Shanghai, whether the members were legal Shanghai residents or migrants with temporary residence permits. The total number of these gift packet tickets was not publicly stated, but perhaps it totaled more than 7 million. Online reports in June and July reported some figures indicating that at least for those months, that between 23 and 29% of visitors to the Expo Park were using the free tickets. At the beginning of August, because foreign reporters had picked up on the idea that the government was subsidizing spectators in order to beat the record of Osaka, there was a clampdown on these reports. It became a very sensitive issue, and the sites were blocked on the internet that were giving figures about how many tickets were coming from the gift packets. Another thing that was rumored in the foreign press, which was certainly true at some level, was that people were being bussed in at government expense in large numbers. But no matter where they came from, it's still the case that a huge domestic audience did attend the fair, and many at their own expense. I encountered 2 young women from the countryside, 2 20-somethings, who had taken a 5-hour train ride to spend the day at the park and who planned to return home that night so they didn't have to spend money living in a room in Shanghai. Like the other spectators who might not ever have the chance to leave China, they were there because they wanted to learn something about the outside world and because it was a historic event that they wanted to experience. And I think that very many people, and in my paper I mentioned the mother of a colleague, the older mother, people felt that China is entering the international community, but I myself will never have a chance to leave China, and going to the Expo is sort of my way of keeping up with the times and being informed about different nations of the world. And in this sense, the motivations of the majority of the domestic audience were not really very different from the audiences at the fin de siècle Western expositions, including the St. Louis exposition in 1904. These expositions were ways of making sense out of the cross-cultural encounters between human beings that began to take place on an unprecedented scale then. It was a kind of popular ethnography or cross-cultural voyeurism that became accessible to the mass public for the first time in the late 19th century. I've argued that in many ways the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was America's equivalent of China's first expo. It was America's coming out party as a world power. In those times, colonial possessions were the major marker of a world power, and the U.S. had just acquired its first colonies, although it did not label them as such, but as a result of the Spanish-American War. And in particular, the Philippines reservation occupied a large proportion of the fairground and was intended to show off the U.S.'s new colonial power. Interestingly, the exposition in St. Louis was the largest one in terms of area until it was finally surpassed by the Shanghai Expo. 1,272 acres in St. Louis versus 1,304 in Shanghai. Attendance figures are interesting too. The attendance figures for the St. Louis Expo actually equaled 26% of the population of the U.S. states and territories at that time, and 1.2% of the global population. And in that sense, the Shanghai Expo only included 1.0% of the global population. So relative to the population of the globe, the numbers were lower. But of course, the actual numbers were quite higher. And you know, one thing that's interesting in this comparison is that since the 1870s, international expositions had been organized around the idea of the progress of civilization, and it was manifested in the spatial arrangement of the fairgrounds. So in St. Louis, the anthropological villages were arranged with the Mbuti pygmies at the bottom of the hill, and along with natives from South America and Canada who were considered particularly primitive. And then as you went up the hill, you would reach the Indian school at the top, which represented the path of civilization from the Stone Age to the U.S. government's efforts at assimilation. The U.S. pavilion, the U.S. government pavilion, was centrally placed. The state pavilions were at the top of the hill, which symbolized civilization. China, interestingly enough, was somewhat peripheral, but it was between Great Britain and Belgium and below Cuba, so it was no more peripheral than they were. This was, by the way, the first official participation by the Qing government in any exposition, 1904. You know, because of all the overwhelming discourse about racial superiority and civilizational progress, the St. Louis World's Fair today is often remembered as the epitome of the racism and imperialism that were the dark side of the world's fairs. A unilinear scheme of the progress of civilization actually underlay the Shanghai Expo, but with a twist. It reversed the usual Western spatial symbolism by placing the China Pavilion in the center, surrounded by Asia and Southeast Asia, with the Americas section on the periphery, below Africa and outside Europe. Western media also observed that Iran and North Korea, the so-called axis of evil, were at the opposite end of the park from the US, with China essentially standing between them. And, you know, of course, this was not just symbolic because perhaps only China could have managed to bring the US, Iran, and North Korea together at such a global event. Western media reacted to the obviously intimidating China Pavilion with comments such as something in between a trade fair, a fun fair, and a template for global domination. And the China Pavilion is very much the powerful host, surrounded by rings of ancient to please guests. And this is a photo I took of the Macau Pavilion kissing the, you know, looks like it's kissing the edge of the China Pavilion, which, I mean, in fact, the China Pavilion was towering way over the little lantern, rabbit lantern, which was the Macau Pavilion. So essentially, this reversed the world order that characterized the early expositions in the West. So for the Chinese audience, the Shanghai Expo was a purveyor of novel cultural experiences, but within a world map that placed the Chinese nation at the civilizing center, towering over its provinces and Hong Kong and Macau and Taiwan, with the rest of the world arrayed outward toward the periphery. So, you know, one thing that's happening here is that in the global competition to establish an image as a world power, China is still trying to win by more or less the same rules it learned in the early 20th century, but it is turning those rules on their head. And I think it's important to draw a lesson from the contrast between the Beijing Games as a media event, in which Westerners conspired with each other to create negative media coverage of China, and the Shanghai Expo as a cultural mega event in which China endeavored to create an image of itself as a dominant power in Asia and perhaps in the world. So these are two mutually reinforcing sides of the same process. And although they may push forward superficial understanding and symbolically reinforce a sense of imagined global community, neither media events nor mega events are really very well designed to achieve genuine dialogue and profound understanding. So now that China's coming out parties are over, perhaps we can get down to more reasonable and less grandiose efforts. Thank you.
Those are some great pictures. Wow. Thank you very much, Professor Brownell. So now we will go to Professor Sun to give the presentation on experiencing cultures, Chinese visitors' encounters with nation brands at the Shanghai Expo. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sun.
Look at this. Anybody can help me get my PPT out? Sorry for that. Yeah, where is it?
You have to go out here. Yeah, you have to go out here.
Oh, sorry.
Was it this one?
Yeah. So does this work? Okay. Okay, first of all, I just want to point out that the first author of this paper, Jay Wang, cannot show up for the conference, so I just have to stand in for the presentation. In fact, I'm still struggling a little bit with my jet lag, so, but I will try to make my presentation a little bit, at least appear to be more energetic. And Susan just mentioned that the World Expo was not a media event. Yeah, I agree with that in some sense. But on the other hand, I just want to point out that even if it's not a media event, the government at least can make it appear to be a media event. And just like, you know, in China, oftentimes we say that in order to make a city develop faster, you have to hold some significant or mega events, just like Beijing. And we have, in China, we have 3 first-tier cities, Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. So Beijing held the World Olympics, Shanghai, the World Expo, and then Guangzhou held the Asian Olympics. So, and maybe in the future, if another city in China intends to get into the first tier, we just speculate the best possibility is to hold the World Cup soccer game. Hopefully it will come true in some day. Okay, and this is for this project, Jay and I did an empirical study, and we examined a couple of questions here. What we're interested in, first of all, is which national pavilion provided the most compelling nation brand experience? Because overall, there are more than 100 national pavilions. So we want to see that how these different national pavilions differ from each other, and how does visitors visiting and experience influence their evaluation of their pavilion. On the other hand, we are also interested in what kind of factors influence visitors' experience during their visiting, and vice versa. What worked, what didn't. So we made 4 arguments. These 4 arguments, in some sense, served as a basis for this project. The first argument is that the World Expo reflects the underlying landscape of international relations. Just like what Susan mentioned, that China can bring the US, Korea, and Iran together, and that is kind of a reflection of international relations. But also, the World Expo could serve as a tournament of culture. There, you can taste Brazil grilled beef and listen to some African music. It's just a showcase of different cultures. The World Expo could serve as a tournament of culture. There, you can taste Brazil grilled beef and listen to some African music. It's just a showcase of different cultures. And the National Pavilion, the third argument is that the National Pavilion can function as a platform for public diplomacy because, in other words, it is designed to win the hearts and the minds of of the general public. Particularly, I want to point out here is that during I think that in the middle of the World Expo, the Chile earthquake occurred. So after the earthquake, the Chile, there is a special rescue tool that is designed to rescue some buried workers, and the tool was sent to China, to the Chile pavilion in China. So and that rescue tool really attracted a large number of audiences and won many Chinese visitors' hearts in some sense. Okay. National pavilions also can shape or rebuild others' perception of a country. For instance, a large number of Chinese people are not that familiar with the United Arab Emirates, but after the World Expo, I will say that a large number of people get to know it well because later on my data will show that the United Arab Emirates is almost the best rated, the highest rated national pavilion. We borrowed the concept brand experience from the marketing literature to study this event. In marketing literature, brand experience is defined as a subjective internal consumer response, which speaks to sensations, feelings, and cognitions. So basically, it is a multidimensional concept. Four different dimensions, as well as behavior responses. Conceptually, the four different dimensions are closely related to each other, and later on I will show that the innate structure of these four different dimensions. Okay. And here are some questions that we employed to study these four different dimensions. So for the first dimension, sensory, some exemplary questions are like this. I find the brand interesting in a sensory way. The brand doesn't appeal to my senses because many pavilions are some pavilions are well known for its light or sound. That speaks to the sensory experience. For the second dimension, affective dimension, some example items are like, I do not have strong emotions for this brand, or this brand is emotional for me. Okay. For the behavioral dimension, and we look at whether visitors regard the pavilion is more action-oriented, or whether there are any physical activities involved in this in their visiting experience. And for the last dimension, intellectual one, questions are like the brand does not make me think, or the brand stimulates my curiosity and problem solving. Here are some two specific research questions that we studied. The first question is, to what extent does the concept brand experience apply to the context of World Expo? Because brand experience has not been well applied to the context of other events like World Expo. And the second question is, how do the national pavilions compare to each other on the four different dimensions of experience? We also made two specific hypotheses. The first one is visitors' sensory and behavior experiences will directly and indirectly influence their affective and intellectual experiences, because we think that the sensory and behavioral experiences will be on the surface, but on the other hand, the intellectual and affective experiences will be deeper. So therefore, we assume that we just speculate the sensory and the behavioral experiences will influence the other two dimensions. And the second hypothesis states that affective and intellectual experiences will influence the visitors' overall evaluation more positively. The higher affective and intellectual experiences, the higher evaluation of the National Pavilion. And here is a simple procedure that by which we conducted this study. We sampled 8 different national pavilions: Brazil, India, Israel, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, United Arab Emirates, the United States. And we sampled the sample. We picked these 8 different pavilions in light of a couple of factors. The first one is about geographic coverage. Try to cover different areas. We also took into account the different countries' relations with China, and some other project-specific factors, like whether this expo has more sensory factors, or it involves more behavioral factors. Overall, we recruited. We studied 480 respondents or visitors. Okay, and 60 visitors per one pavilion. Based on prior research, we modified the instruments that I introduced just a minute ago, and adapted them to the context of the World Expo event. And in the study, we also incorporated some other instruments, such as some personality factors and pavilion evaluation, demographics, and contextual information. The method that we used is primarily intercept interviews, and we hired about 36 graduate students to help us conduct the interviews. Each participant received a free entrance ticket and a small amount of cash. Okay. But that's enough for them. Okay. So here's the graph about the innate structure of the 4 different brand experience dimensions. Basically, the graph shows that sensory, affective, intellectual dimensions are more tightly related to each other. If we look at them, we can see that these 3 types of experiences are more subjective. In contrast, behavioral dimension is less subjective. But again, here we can see the relationship 0.59, the number here, shows that the subjective experience is still closely related to the behavior experience. So this is a general structure of the 4 different dimensions. Okay, and this graph shows the comparison. The comparison of the brand experiences between along the 4 different dimensions. So if you look at this, AE represents the United Arab Emirates. So this country really scores high on both sensory and on both the blue line. Okay, this is sensory. Okay. So this is United Arab. So it really scored very high on both sensory and intellectual dimensions. Okay. So which national pavilion scored the lowest? It is, so when it's India scored very low on the behavior and affective dimension. ZA refers to South Africa, which scored low on all of the 4 dimensions. And basically, we can also see that the scores on along the sensory dimension fluctuates kind of consistently with the affective with the intellectual dimension. Yeah, these 2 lines fluctuate in the same trend. Yeah. So if we look at this, and based on the conceptual links, based on the conceptualization of the brand experience, at the beginning we hypothesized the following relationship. That is, sensory and behavioral dimensions will influence intellectual and affective ones, and the intellectual and affective dimensions will influence visitors' overall evaluation of pavilions. In other words, intellectual and affective dimensions will be approximate precursors of the pavilion evaluation, and sensory and behavioral experiences will serve as some kind of distant precursors or predictors of pavilion evaluation. And the results turned out to be a little bit different. And we can see that in general, the hypothesized relationships were supported. But one path that was not supported is the relationship between behavioral experience and intellectual experience. So basically, behavioral experience does not have much to do with the intellectual experience. And behavioral experience only influenced the affective experience significantly, but sensory experience influenced both intellectual and affective ones. And the effects from intellectual and affective experiences to the overall evaluation were supported, as presented in this graph. Okay. So a brief summary of the findings. Conceptually, we just showed that the 4 different dimensions, sensory, behavioral, affective, and intellectual, can be applied to the context of the World Expo. And also sensory experience positively affected the intellectual experience. Both intellectual and affective experience are strong precursors of the pavilion evaluation. And the visitors rated the United Arab Emirates and Spain as the strongest national brand experience. Indeed, if we, although I did this project, but I even didn't have I cannot find a chance to visit the United Arab Emirates, because to visit this pavilion, you have to wait for about 7 hours in the line. That really scared me. That you can see that how popular it is. And the United Arab Emirates and Spain pavilions are really full of high-tech sound, light, the razzle-dazzle are really very attractive. So that really provides the visitors a strong sensory experience: the light, the sound, and high-tech. But on the other hand, if you just, in fact, if I didn't show it here, the United States, the United States pavilion is just rated as so-so, because if you enter the US pavilion, primarily they just show you a very short video, and this is too many visitors. That's a little bit boring. It's not surprising that the United Arab Emirates and Spain attracted a large number of visitors. because of the strong sensory experiences. But South Africa and India pavilions as the least compelling, particularly on the sensory dimension. These two countries scored very low. And I will, also another point, another factor could be related to the design of their pavilions. If you go to look at Spain pavilion, the structure is more like linear. That is, the visitors, once they enter the pavilion, they just have to go through a certain route. You have to look at it one by one. But for Indian and South African pavilions, it's more like an open space. So the visitors have more freedom. They can just walk around. This could also influence their overall evaluation. And I think that one point the point I have to emphasize a little bit is that because there is a large crowd of visitors, and it is very hard to keep a strong attention span from the visitors. And typically for each pavilion, the visitors can only stay for a very short period of time. For instance, if you enter the Spain pavilion and you can only spend less than 10 minutes inside because people keep entering, and there's a big crowd. Maybe that is also why there's another factor that we have to take into account when interpreting the results. When the attention span is very short, you have to think about how to strengthen the sensory experiences instead of affective experiences. So overall, the pavilions delivered relatively weak affective experiences, but Korea provided the strongest behavioral experiences. Although it provides the strongest behavioral experience, but it does not make much difference. So basically, the effect of behavioral experience is not that strong, as shown in the current study. Above, I just, on behalf of my co-author, Jay, and I present the major findings here. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. We have a discussant who will discuss all three of these papers, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and answers. So I'd like to welcome Yunxiang Yan, Anthropology and Director of the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA.
Thank you, Professor Kang. Well, first I have to apologize for missing the sessions yesterday and also this morning, because I have been having this terrible headache. When I came here this afternoon, I told Ben this. Guess what Ben told me? Ben says, "You have no idea what you missed." That made my headache even worse. And also, since I have taken too many pills, so whatever I'm going to say could be the residual effect of either my headache or the painkillers. I'm not going to take much responsibilities. All right, so when you do play the role of discussion, you're trying to find out, number one, the commonalities among a variety of papers. Number two, the different approaches they are taken, and also the interrelations among them. Those are the regular things you normally do. So what are the commonalities of our three papers here in this afternoon's session? Diversity. There's not much commonalities. You address totally different things. That's what you get when you deal with academic perspective or academic views, I guess. But overall, I think they do take a rather institutional-centered approach to analyzing various phenomena related to theme parks in China, although probably Professor Haiyuan wouldn't agree with me because he emphasizing on self-formation. But later on, I will explain why I'm still thinking that his paper is still taking an institutional approach. So having said that, let me go over the papers one by one, starting from the last one, because that is the order I read those papers yesterday. And Su Shaojing and Jay Wang's paper. And so I do probably, to save time, I don't need to do the summary since you just presented it. Basically, these 4 indicators of the effectiveness of building or transmitting national brand is a kind of a very interesting market analysis strategy. And also, it tells us something about the cross-cultural communication. I think to me, the most important thing in cross-cultural communication is what come across. It's not what come across, it's the other way around, what have been getting lost during this cross-cultural communication. And while reading their paper, what interests me most, and I was hoping to hear today more from Professor Su's presentation, unfortunately I didn't hear it, that is what constitute specifically the 4 indicators in the context of Chinese culture. What do we mean by sensory? What do we mean by behavioral, which it basically means the participation part of this presentation, so on and so forth. And because these 4 indicators might be universally applicable, but when they are applied to a specific culture, and there got to be certain local modifications and adjustment, and so on and so forth. And that is what make cross-cultural communication so interesting, so complicated, and mostly unsuccessful in many cases. For instance, if we look at how the United States and China trying to communicate with each other, in general, you can observe an interesting phenomenon. That is, the US tended to address the grassroots whenever it go out, and the people. Why? I think it has a lot to do with the nature of politics, the electoral politics here. From a Chinese perspective, it doesn't make much sense. A presidential candidate went to a parking lot talking to 15 people. Totally not making sense. But probably for the American crowd, it doesn't make much sense of a Chinese political leader in a closed-door meeting make some important statement and later on, through a very well-regulated channel being conveyed to the masses. It doesn't make much sense either. So that's why when the Chinese ads on Times Square in New York City were out, it didn't produce the kind of expected result in the United States. Number one, American people don't know those people. Number two, even if they know something, they don't give much meaning to those famous people, like famous scientists who made a contribution to China, so on and so forth. Well, if you look at the US pavilion in World Expo, what did they deliver? And Professor Su just briefly mentioned it. It started with, I don't know how many of you were there. How many of you were there? Only a few. So I had to explain. It started, basically, all 4 sessions are featuring video clips, right? The first one started with a variety of individuals say, 你好. I think Americans made a great effort, especially these people are from a great variety of common background, representing what? Diversity. Diversity is so important in our culture. We're trying to showcase that, yet it didn't get across. Chinese audience get confused. Why those people are here? They know who is Kobe Bryant. They know who is Bill Clinton. They didn't know other people, right? And then the second session, they do something, a small drama, emphasizing one thing, that is community building. If we all participate, we could build a good community. It's a small story, how a little girl trying to plant a flower in a very dirty courtyard in New York City, maybe, so on and so forth. Chinese didn't get it either. So this is the thing, I think early on, Professor Su briefly mentioned what he meant by sensory. sensory. That means in Chinese context, it is the effect of high-tech, science, and mostly modernity. When they come to World Expo, they are looking for modernity, along with other things. That's why a number of pavilions, like United Arab Emirates pavilion, you get this kind of effect, right? So this is my major point. You get to break it down and to explore why one of each of the four works or not work in this particular cultural context. And then by breaking them down, and then you understand what the Chinese audience are looking for and what they don't like, so on and so forth. And behind that, there are bigger issues. For instance, we all know there's this difference between ethics of conviction and ethics of responsibility. In the second part, they are looking for exemplary figures to lead. This is why in the Chinese cultural context, 名人效应, these famous people, their good behavior are so important. And well, in the Western side, it is the core values. And if you convict those core values, and you automatically participate as individuals and so forth. Those are all behind the bigger ideas behind this. So I found the paper overall very interesting, very stimulating, but then in the sense that it pushed me to think more issues like this. And so for that, I really am very grateful to Professor Su and Professor Wang for doing this really wonderful and empirical research. Now, to Susan Brownell's paper, and it is very clear, and through this comparative comparison between the US episode of 1904 Expo and the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai, so on and so forth. And several major points, that is the marketing strategy between BIE and IOC, and also the central importance of politics in making a global media event. And one we think we have to remember is that politics, from the global media's point of view, is mostly relevant to the core values of the Western culture, like human rights, right? And therefore, it's not the politics kind of a real global politics. And in that sense, and Susan Brownell explained very well about why, even if it doesn't attract global media attention as much as the Olympics, it still attracted 73 million visitors from China and other countries as well, although we don't know how big the proportion of foreign visitors is. And I had nothing to add except one more question to my very good friend Susan. That is these domestic implications, because World Expo, so far, Susan Brownell read it from, again, an institutional approach, from also an outside-in approach, focusing on the global impact implications. But to me, especially if you talk with visitors in China, when they did this, like the visitors she mentioned who traveled so long distance to Shanghai and spending 5 hours there and back home again. What attracted them? That is, to me, equally important, which part we don't get much out of today's presentation. And I hope we could hear more about that. And if, again, from a very far distance, if we read it, one more thing deserves our attention. That is this feeling of national pride. And allow me to express it in Chinese. This is in Chinese language, it's 恭逢盛世，万国来朝. I happen to be born in this splendid time of this dynasty and witness all foreign countries coming to our country to pay tribute. This is not just an elite idea. It's widely shared by ordinary people and smartly being conveyed by the Chinese state by using Olympics in 2008, Olympic Games in 2008, and the World Expo in 2010. And that kind of implications are equally important, I think, for us to explore. And otherwise, you cannot explain why the Chinese government pays so much, right? And spend so much money, even buy tickets for Chinese people to visit. This is one. Again, if you look at the domestic implications, another one is the urge, the curiosity of knowing outside the world, and the urge to do that. And many visitors, those ordinary people, did pay the ticket themselves and spend hours to know this. And that urge and that curiosity has a lot to do with the blocked flow of information, and also has a lot to do with this self-driven force of catching up, which in turn together explain the recent rise of China. The recent global ascending of China has a lot to do with government policies, but equally important has a lot to do with the highly motivated, even exploitative individuals who drive themselves crazy to work hard. A new phenomenon, what I call the striving individual. And part of the characteristics of the striving individual is to understand, to know the outside world. And finally, and to Professor Hairen's paper, and the first part, he didn't spend much. This is a full-length, very complicated paper. I spent several hours trying to understand it, and still having some puzzle though. And the first part, basically, he used the second part he presented today to demonstrate his major arguments. That is, China has gone through a neoliberal transformation and a transition from a socialist country to a neoliberal state, where he just mentioned this, where the individuals are pushed to bear more responsibility, so on and so forth. And another interesting argument he didn't have time to present is that the reunification element, for instance, return of Hong Kong, and again, the future prospect of reunite with Taiwan has a lot to do with this neoliberal transformation, which is a very inspiring argument, at least to me. And therefore, individuals are disciplined, and therefore are remade through even consumption into these new neoliberal subjects or individuals. That is a major point. Now, here comes the different understanding between him and me. My question is China, contemporary China, a neoliberal state? No. Why? Because Susan Brownell just said so. She said, in her paper at least, the Shanghai municipal government spent a huge amount of money to buy gifts, tickets, a package, and pay for the entrance fees for these citizens to visit World Expo. How many of them? I think it's either 21 or 29% of all the tickets in municipal Shanghai belong to that gift tickets. Does a neoliberal state normally do this? No, it should be the opposite, right? That's why I said no. And then how the individuals are disciplined and to bear responsibilities. According to Professor Hairen, the whole theme park is a training ground where people are forced to learn. And here, basically, I think Hairen's paradigm has two elements. One is this neoliberal state, which is almost omnipotent and also representing global capitalism, are doing these things. But we don't have a very concrete picture about who are the states and how does this state do this. But on the other hand, you have these individuals being disciplined. And however, if you look at his three examples, I'm not sure, I'm not entirely at least convinced individuals are disciplined that way. And number one, we haven't heard from the individuals. Basically, this is Professor Hairen's reading by observing them. Actually, you could do one more thing. Ask this woman, what do you feel when you stole that umbrella? And so would be the case with that man who burned the incense and do the little worship. So, but to me, those, especially, let's take the case of this self-disciplining effort by onlookers and the shopkeeper to be imposed on that poor woman who tried to steal the umbrella. Is that a neoliberal thing? I think even in the agrarian society, long before the birth of neoliberalism, stealing should be stopped. And chances are your neighbors would stop you, right? And again, so basically, I'm just questioning whether this powerful paradigm might have led Professor Hairen read too much neoliberalism into China, where the most important thing for me is that China does not even have liberalism yet, right? And because all these theories coming from Western Europe and the United States, where this as even the critique of neoliberalism is meant to be a counterbalance force, but on the same base of political democracy, political liberalism, so on and so forth. And well, if we look at China, you can think of this, one of these two things. What does China need more, or equally important? The critique of neoliberalism or a neoliberal critique? So that is my question. I will rest there. Thank you very much.
Maybe, is this, good. Maybe if I can ask the panel, the presenters to join me up on the stage and discussant as well. Why not come join us? And we'll open up now to questions and answers from the crowd, because this is a truly wonderful set of papers, and I learned a lot. And so I'll be looking forward to hearing your questions. I will be running the show, so anybody want? Do we have mics also? Are we going to be handing out mics? Do we have a mic? Ah, yeah, okay.
And Grace said that I should talk to the tech people about showing the teaser, which we have, and it shows the exhibition pavilions. We spent 3 weeks, my team of USC School of Architecture and USC School of Cinema faculty. We went to the World Expo for 3 weeks. We got 7 press passes, so we were able to access pretty much almost all the pavilions except for Japan. And we spent 3 weeks interviewing the Chinese public about what their impressions were, why they decided to go to what pavilions. We have over 40 hours of footage and 450 pages of transcription, half of them in Mandarin. So I'm not sure exactly how I'm supposed to do this, but we can show you a visual. And we've posed the film. It's actually going to be a feature film documentary. And we've already gotten a lot of attention from the New York Times, and we've gotten press from KCRW and such. So we're supposed to be done next year. But we've posed it in regards to why America has declined in this economic recession. And in a way, this is kind of the synopsis. The design profession is up in arms about the poor face, and I guess this would answer Yang's issue of face. The design profession is up in arms about the poor face of the USA Pavilion at Expo 2010 in Shanghai. We used to understand how important it was to showcase our best innovations by creating spectacular pavilions with messages about American ingenuity. Over 73 million people attended this event. And just so you know, it was 10 million international visitors. The biggest consumer market to emerge for the next 25 years, and we didn't show them our best innovations. We wonder why America is in an economic recession. We made a mistake, but American ingenuity is all about taking risks and falling down. It's time to get back up. Face of a Nation reveals the importance of design innovation in global politics because architecture sends a powerful political message to the world. So some of this, I think, in a way, might address some of your issues in terms of research. And actually, is Grace here? I don't know. She wanted, should I go talk to tech? Because you can, I'm not sure if you wanted to see some of the pavilions. That's something that you can watch. She told me to.
Just maybe after the panel has a chance to interact with the questions that Yunchang has raised and with the questions that people have here, maybe at the conclusion you could screen that.
Okay.
We'll do that. We'll do it that way. So does anybody have a question from the audience? Yeah, go ahead and go ahead and. Are we going to be bringing mics around, or do we?
I have a question more specifically to Professor Yu's paper, and it's a really inspiring presentation. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by middle-class norms in relation to the mechanisms of neoliberalism. And also in your presentation, you mentioned that you have some very interesting observations with how people use media technologies like digital camera or digital cam to interact with the theme park spaces. And you also show some really amazing pictures of the theme streets and shopping malls. So I wonder how would that be different for these two kind of spaces, the theme parks and the shopping malls? Because it seems to me that the theme parks emphasize in this kind of one-day spectacular consumption, while the theme shopping malls seems to be more like everyday consumption. So, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. I think we'll do it that way. If you can keep your question short, then we can have some short answers, and we'll get as many people going as possible. So, you each have a.
Yeah. That's 3 questions.
Choose your favorite.
Choose my favorite. Well, the last one, short. I think my interest of linking themed theme parks and themed shopping malls, gated communities together. I want to think about storytelling, how a particular way of making meanings tied to spatial production of social relations, which are also related to the middle class, the making of middle class norms. Many of you know that there's a kind of studies of development of urban spaces in China. Many argue that many of those people who run their lives on their own because they're run by private developers and property management companies. So state doesn't really get into their lives, you know. So partially I'm trying to consider the commonalities of self-responsibilities and life-making process. The technologies, that's too complicated. Maybe I will talk to you individually. It's save time.
Great. Somebody else? Yes.
Hi, this is a question for Sun Laoshi. I'm interested in finding out more. You talked about the cultivation of nation brands within the Expo context. And I was wondering, actually, related back to what Mina had just said, if you extended your analysis to talk about how those nation brands within the Expo context in any way related to the deployment of those brands in Shanghai outside of the Expo context. So for example, in trade promotion activities or in kind of other nation building or public diplomacy activities. So was there kind of a cross-branding strategy like we saw this morning for Disney for these individual Expo sites?
It should just go on.
Oh, thank you for the question. Regarding the brand experience, regarding the branding strategy, when we borrowed this concept, we searched the literature, and indeed, I think that if you enter the World Expo campus, you can see that different nations use different branding branding strategies. I will see that, and when I talk this point with Jay, and I think that it depends. The first point I want to make here is that it depends on how a nation defines its identity, because their branding strategy really departures from their identity. If, for instance, like South Africa. And if you South Africa, if you enter that pavilion, you can see that it's not that fancy, and just some people might their products and some music, very low tech, not that high tech. But on the other hand, you can see that this nation defines its identity as a very authentic, very kind of countryside. Like raw and coarse. I think that's the identity. So in this case, I really think that we do need to. We're also interested in this. I think because in fact this study has not incorporated some other data we did. But on the other hand, we interviewed some pavilion designers and staff members, and in those interviews we asked them, how they define their identity, and what kind of messages they want to send out. And I think that if we compare their perspective with our interviews with the visitors, that might give us a more clear picture of it. But the key point here, I think that the departure from the identity, and the second point, maybe another factor is about, I think that another factor is more related to, the business opportunities. When you enter some pavilions, you can see, particularly if some activities are more likely to create some trade opportunities, trade businesses with China. I think that that is more likely to be incorporated into their branding strategies. Okay, I hope that can help you. Thank you.
Let me just make sure, is there anybody else who I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to get involved, if there are other people who want to ask questions, just so that we make sure that everyone gets involved. Yes.
Oh, yes, I just want to use this opportunity actually to repeat Professor Yan's question and asking Professor Renhai and to answer the question about the Chinese society being a neoliberal society, and from which position you are defining this society as a neoliberal society. Okay, thanks.
I know that question will always come back. Well, I don't think, well, anyway, I appreciate the close reading and very critical comments. I do, really, this is not the first time. I think when I think about neoliberalism, I'm not really thinking about the kind of models as we already see from the US models. You think about, the state, declines, the market, everything. I'm thinking about mostly how neoliberalism actually began to change developed in China, and but also try to avoid, when I say neoliberal China, I always try to differentiate that from socialist China, post-socialist China, capitalist China, post-Mao China, because all those terms have a kind of baggages. I approach from the problem of national sovereignty. That's why I look at Hong Kong's return to China. As many of you know, Hong Kong ranks #1 in terms of the neoliberal index in the world. The poster child of the neoliberal economy in the world. And China, of course, is on the opposite side, right? But 1984, when the Chinese government signed the joint declaration with the British government to protect Hong Kong's prosperity, which means Chinese government will stand out to protect the neoliberal economy in the world, and as an international, as if they signed another Nanjing 条约, the the Treaty of Nanjing. But this time is on their term, So the national sovereignty issue is Deng Xiaoping said, national sovereignty unification issue. You can't discuss. It has to be decided, So the exception is very important. That's the precise definition of the sovereign who decides on an exceptional case. So when I talk about neoliberalism as applied in everyday life, so I'm looking at how individuals began to kind of deal with social norms and try to make sense of what's going on in their life by being, exceptional to whatever is happening inside China. But this has to do with old kind of standards of ways of living are no longer available to them. And, the danwei system, the kind of welfare programs available to them. So they have to figure out how do they build their own lives. That's why I try to emphasize on the idea of do-it-yourself biographical process. I guess some of you know this draws on the long tradition of risk society model, but I tried not to go into those scholarship, but try to figure out what's going on in China. I think consumption is one way to bring out all those issues. As the Chinese government try to let the Chinese citizen to take responsibilities, they would not really allow them to do other things other than through mostly, I shouldn't make such a kind of clear-cut statement, but I have to say consumption is one of the arenas to look at those kind of subtle changes, how individuals began to take in charge of their lives. Of course, consumption is not simply about buying things. It's about citizenship. It's about legal issues, rights, and all those things, right? So lots of those kind of larger human rights issues or things are not particularly, they are relevant, but I think it's more important to look at the subtle level of the everyday, then you can really understand how the nuances really affects individuals, how they live as Chinese citizens in this new century.
Can I say something
Sure.
about the?
Please.
Yeah, I would actually then like to give empirical support for Yun Chang's statement, because event management in China today is really fascinating, because it's really, especially mega event management, is a barometer of the state of governance in China. And there has always been and there still is a problem with the sale of tickets to big events, because traditionally vast numbers of tickets disappear through the back door. And at the Shanghai Expo, the coordinating bureau actually, and the Shanghai government was on board when they were making the initial planning. They really wanted to make this a marketized event in which they really were going to sell as many tickets as possible. And then what happened was that as the event neared and as it got underway, they realized they weren't going to reach their target audience of spectators, 70 million. And so they, in steps then, they kind of demarketized it by first settling on this gift packet measure, which, approximately, we don't know, maybe 7 million tickets were distributed. It appears, and then all of this is really top secret, sort of, it's not publicly announced. It's the kind of thing that you hear people...
we're taping this.
Yeah. Oh, are you really? Yeah, well. I mean, it's the kind of thing where you, through the grapevine, you hear that this went on. So, I mean, I can't say that this is based on scientific research, but this is what I heard people in the coordinating bureau talking about, and just, that... As time went on, then they started distributing more tickets. It kind of appears that every village head in Zhejiang province got a ticket. There were huge amounts of local officials that were bussed in to the Expo Park. And so in the end, some of my friends working for the Expo Bureau says, even we don't know where all those people came from.
Great. And I should have actually asked you guys to introduce yourselves, even though we probably know most of us. But Clay, did you want to? So briefly just say who you are before you ask your question.
I'm Clay. Clay Dubey with the USC, U.S.-China Institute. Great papers, just as all of the presentations have been wonderful throughout the conference. Yun Chang mentioned, the institutional approach that our three panelists used. And I think he's quite correct both to point that out and also to ask for something a little bit different, which is why we're waiting for him to write on this subject. But one reason for the institutional approach is that the Expo was organized by the nation state. You could only participate as an agent of a nation state. There were some NGOs and there were some industry pavilions, and they were located across the river, right? They were physically separate. And so the United States, by virtue of having a law that prohibits the US government for funding the thing, actually had to go through a lot of sleight of hand to have Department of State on the entrance for the pavilion, because technically it was organized by a company that had received the contract to do so. And so an institutional approach makes perfect sense because it was organized by an institution, the main participants were institutions, and in fact all of these 170 countries that participated were supporting actors in this Chinese drama, right? And it was very much for the consumption of the domestic audience. And so I think Yunchang, by emphasizing the world coming to China, showing up and staying for a long time, putting up buildings that would soon disappear, that did matter. At the same time, we really need to understand the human component, I think, in this. I was stunned by people running from pavilion to pavilion. I mean, I was just stunned by that. So anxious to get in line for the next pavilion, seeking to make the most of their few hours. What does that mean? Obviously, the study of tourism and the study of this sort of thing is fairly underdeveloped. We had a colleague here who was misidentified once as studying tourism. But I think that colleague could have embraced that, because how we choose to spend our free time is so very important. It's one measure of what's going on. And I'm wondering if the three panelists might speak to that. Now, Professor Shi and Professor Wang both have touched on that. And with regard to putting Spain at the top of the list, I was wondering whether or not there was any effort to control for the fact that Spain won the World Cup at that moment, and that they draped that giant baby with the World Cup banner. And I was wondering whether, how you control for these things that happen, completely separate from standing in line, going through the experience. But I do want to say thank you for some wonderful presentations.
Anyone want to? Professor Sun, maybe? You want to say something there?
I mean, that part I really don't know how to address. I really don't know how to respond to that particular question. Because although I mean that I entered the campus a couple of times, but I mean, once I went there, on behalf of my to visit my students, because many of my students serve as volunteers on the campus. But with regard to the element to the question that you mentioned, I really don't know how to answer it. Yeah.
Any of you want? Yes, why don't?
Well, to support Clay's observation, there's another thing very peculiar. That is how many people in the World Expo running back and forth to collect passport stamps.
That was the biggest.
Yeah, so much so that the person who in charge of chopping those things eventually give up. In many pavilions, it's just hurt their waist. So here, I think my observation is that in many cases, individual Chinese, when they go on a tour, they do it for other people as well. So basically, it's another issue, about consumption. How individualistic or how individual-oriented is consumption in China? Do the Chinese consume for others as well? So I spend most of my time studying individualization in China, but meanwhile, what I always keep in mind is this entanglement between individualistic and collective values. And those people who went to World Expo, part of the task is reporting back to the people they know in the village, in the community, what was going on there, especially those who from provinces, from long distance, from the countryside. And in a similar way, just 2 weeks ago, I received 2 young women from Shanghai out of this long weekend holiday of the National Day. Their task is what? Shopping in Los Angeles. In the entire 7 days, they basically covered every single mall in Los Angeles area. But how much did they buy for themselves? No more than $300 or $500 US. All the rest in their entire 2 large suitcases were for somebody else. So that collective aspect of consumption and something else should be taken into account, even in terms of tourism.
Did you want to take one? Good. We'll give you the. Thanks. Just so Dan can hear you.
Okay. I actually would like to comment. Oh, I'm sorry. Bin Wong, Asian Institute, UCLA. I want to comment directly on this and then lead back. I think I'm going to try to make 3 points, getting back to yesterday's conversation as well with the debate that's taking place here is related, I think, to what we were talking about yesterday. Firstly, on this issue of individuals and consumption, the other aspect of the passport phenomenon and representing other individuals in consumption is the fact that a secondary market developed for the purchase of completed passports. That is to say, there was a market that an informal market where you could buy a completed passport, which is a symbol of your having been somewhere where you weren't, but it had a token, a symbolic value of its own. So there's lots of issues about the nature of consumption that are worth pursuing in a Chinese context, and in this context in particular. But at the same time, it seems to me crucial to recognize is, those of us study China, it's so easy, other than anthropologists, it's easy to do institutions, and I've spent many years largely doing institutions because it's what we can document, it's what we can analyze, et cetera, et cetera. But now that, especially from anthropologists, with the bottom up and being able to talk to people, one of the things I was struck by in Shanghai in the summer of 2010, I made the decision, perhaps mistake, to teach 39 UCLA extension students Shanghai Expo as a course to teach them about Shanghai and about World Expositions. In any event, I was stuck there that summer in the heat, and I did go to Expo. And I also, though, talked to people, the people you talk to in Shanghai, the number of people for whom Shanghai Expo was a government activity, as you're saying, and therefore they had nothing to do with it. They got the gift packs and they didn't go. The people near where I was living would feel sympathy for the people who would come in from out of town, have no place to sleep, and think they were crazy for doing it. As far as they're concerned, they weren't interested in Expo. So it's important to recognize there were any number of Chinese for whom and this in one level supports, especially what in this context, what Yunxiang was saying about the importance of the government. There were people for whom it being a government activity made it precisely something they were not interested in. And that aspect of what politics is today in China is also underwrites part of this. Now, the second and larger point I want to make, however, has to do with this issue of how we assess the role of the Chinese government today in its various guises and the role of a market society. Both are clearly taking place. Yesterday's conversation, especially on the industry panel, as those of you who were there will recall, there was a tension between how to assess the Chinese government's role as a censor and how to mediate that role with the role of market forces. And to put it crudely, it seemed to me people were taking sides as to which we should be thinking more or less about. There's a parallel today, whether we're stressing the degree to which the Chinese state in its current guise still has distinctive characteristics which shape and motivate a lot of what we see, versus the degree to which we're trying to understand from the individual's consumption point of view, the degree to which people are being constructed socially in ways very different than they were 20, 30 years ago. Both are true. It seems to me the challenge for academics now is to sort out through empirical research how those two axes actually empirically intersect in ways that allow us to identify what's similar and different. I'm sorry, this sounds so damn abstract, but what's similar and different in these cases from what we might see elsewhere. It seems to me that's what's at stake, and it's a huge set of stakes because this Chinese media and contemporary culture experience is so profound both for China and its influence in the world. In any event, that sounds, so I invite you to think, I invite the panelists to consider how to take on the other dimension that you're anxious about being inadequate, so that both the notion of the nature of this government and the nature of the change in the consumption experience are simultaneously being engaged. Thank you.
Yeah, you want to take a cut at that? And then maybe what we'll do is, in the interest of time, I'll go to each of you and let each of you make a couple minutes response both to the questions and to the discussant. How's that? And then maybe we'll turn to a summing up. How does that sound?
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead to answer if you can Ben's question.
I think
just in general.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments, and also I think it is challenging for us to think about the role of the Chinese government in relation to the market. Partially because as a scholar, we just try to be confined within our own kind of a discipline. And so it's very challenging to talk about broader issues, also by pay attention to the strengths of your own scholarship. So one thing I learned by writing my first book, which is listed on the Hong Kong's Return to China, the public kind of history project, is really lots of things people could not think through, which means there are certain kind of incommensurable dimensions we have to address. They're not simply just try to figure out the scholarships and model to make them work. However, there's a different way to think about it. I try to talk about how public relations model would enable some of the different things to go beyond the traditional public propaganda model, which is using the Hong Kong's countdown as a giant kind of a, nationwide, even international activities to do lots of those things. Another point is, I think Yunxiang and Susan also kind of hint that, it's true, Shanghai government give tickets to people to go. It's also true, some might not go. But this doesn't necessarily mean it's not a neoliberal. One of the neoliberal theorists, who is a behavior economist, a Chinese guy, I won't really mention his name, but affiliated with the Chicago school, argued that there's for a concept of something called super firm, sort of an economic organization that take on the advantage of the state's role to become more powerful than a private company, because that's what the Chinese neoliberal state is about. It's a super firm because it can take advantage of laws and legal means to do things more than, and also administrative kind of efforts, more than a private company can do, whether or not it's in China or from other countries. So this is one thing I try to address that question.
Thank you.
Well, I am an anthropologist, and I actually did start out when I was studying my first mega event, the 1987 Chinese National Sports Games. I studied the hoi polloi, right? So I studied the athletes and the spectators, and then heading into the Beijing Olympics and then finally the Expo, I actually switched, and I became more interested precisely in the institutional structures because as I better understood how these events were organized, I started to feel that there's a transnational elite that drives the organization of these networks, which is actually somewhat detached from everyday people and the spectators. And a lot of what goes on isn't even really oriented towards attracting spectators. It's about the power play and the international networks that are being formed. And I mean, it's really interesting that these networks are sort of becoming more and more closely knit even as we sit here. You could see, for example, there were members of the International Olympic Committee, the member from Norway, who was the director of the IOC's marketing commission, and then uses the Beijing Olympic Games as a platform to start doing marketing consulting inside China. So then he finally ends up being one of the VIPs taken around the Shanghai Expo. So I mean, you start to see the whole thing getting connected by relationships between these elites who are, in the case of the IOC, they're not corporate elites. They're volunteers working for an NGO, but they're hooked up with corporate elites and political elites. They're traveling back and forth. And they're attending these mega events, and they have fun. And that's probably one reason that they, back in their home countries, they push different cities to bid to host the events. So I think, I'm not even sure I want to call that institutional. I mean, that's the conventional way of looking at it, but in the end, these are networks between powerful individual people, and I think the interesting thing is to do the empirical research that shows even, for example, the Chinese super firm. It's not really a super firm either. It's a network of powerful individuals, and we can use the same anthropological methods that we use to study low-level spectators, and to study them as well.
Because my area is primarily media studies, so I look at this event more from a media research perspective. And indeed, looking back at the World Expo, I really think that before the event was held, and there were a lot of media hypes there, in some sense. And if you lived in Shanghai, I mean that a couple of months before the event was held, every day on the TV, it's just about the World Expo. So it really, give you a high expectation. That is why that, we interviewed some people. They said, before we entered this campus, we really think that, the World Expo is going to be magnificent. But when we come out, it's really, it's disappointing in some sense. So media indeed played a significant role in this process, and I do think there's a great media hype there. And second, think about this, the whole process. I also think that the government did provide some, some special benefits to the general public. For instance, besides the free tickets, also the government provide some extra holidays that the general public can enjoy and take their time to visit the pavilions, and also there is a large. Based on my observation, and in fact, there is a large number of visitors. I mean, a large portion of the visitors are government civil servants, because typically they just organize people, to come to Shanghai, like for some training, and they can use this opportunity also, at the same time. Okay, let's spend some time to visit the World Expo. So try to make the best use of the time for training at the same time for visit. And the third point, also I think that the World Expo in some way it's related to nationalism. In many Chinese people's eyes, the World Expo is not just a World Expo. It's a Chinese. It's served as a face of China. So it seems that to some, okay, buy a ticket to visit, or even if it's a free ticket, if I go there, and that's also my support, for my country, for my government, and they can help, further build the image of China on the world arena. But also, I think that is why that after the World Expo was finished, and the government announced that it is really it's a great success. But sometimes, life is very ridiculous. That is, as soon as the World Expo ended, a great fire broke out in Shanghai, and more than 50 people lost lives. So that is why that sometimes we say this is a success, but on the other hand, that is a failure, and so that really it also hurt the image we try to build. So just some thoughts.
Great. Well, I think Andrea. Yes.
I think there's one more. Oh, are there other questions?
No, we were going to try and.
Oh, right. Okay. I just want to make sure that the clip got shown.
Right. Yeah. So we'll do the clip right now, and. We're not going to do the clip? Yes. Here we go.
face, isn't it?
This is about preserving your reputation, preserving your face, the image that people have of you. And it's very much, of course, a part of standard diplomacy.
因为我觉得什么东西都要最好的一面，你只有准备很充分了，你才能把最好的一面去展现给他。
可是你从侧面看就觉得它是一种像贝壳。
We wanted to combine, you know, it's like you're not talking about this past, this present, this future.
But just by building a large baby, I don't think I don't get that message.
The Chinese pavilion emphasizes Chinese history, Chinese tradition, Chinese culture. The message they want to send, the issue of face there, is to show that China's a peaceful, harmonious country.
我觉得美国馆还是挺平易近人的。
美国馆应该是一个比较开放的、自由的，对不对啊？美国人向往自由嘛，民主的，对不对？
Americans are not particularly interested in face. This is something that was an obligation. They had to show up, so they put something together.
Ni hao, I'm Hillary Clinton, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you, on behalf of the American people, to the USA Pavilion at Expo 2010.
那如果说让你用几个词来形容美国馆，你会用什么词？
If that's the way America would participate in the Expo, I would say it's just better not to do it.
All right. Great. Well, I guess that will conclude the presentation. Thanks. Let's give a nice round of applause to everyone who participated here.